لطيف، بس بنشكركم على التضحيات اللي عملتوها، انكم فضلتوا تيجوا على المحاضرة بدل ما تطلعوا تتشمسوا. المحاضرة هذه هي الثانية من نوعها في موضوع الرصد والمراقبة، بقدمها البروفيسور ديفيد ليون. موضوع محاضرة اليوم هو بعنوان الصواب والخطأ في الرصد والمراقبة، الأخلاق، الحريات المدنية، والكرامة الإنسانية. في هذه المحاضرة سيتم التطرق إلى مدى تأثير وسائل الرصد والمراقبة على سيادة القانون وحقوق الإنسان، وعليه سيتم تدارس معالجة المصادر والمرجعيات القيمية هنا كويس والأخلاقية المتاحة لمجابهة المراقبة الشاملة في عصرنا الرقمي. من ضمن المواضيع التي ستتناولها هذه المحاضرة أيضا هي سؤال السيناريوهات والاحتمالات الأقل سوءا على غرار رائعة جورج أورويل 1984 وأهمية الشطح ورسم مستقبلات بديلة تصون ازدهار الأفراد وكرامتهم في هذا العالم المفروض علينا نعيش فيه كلنا كانديفيدوالز أو كمواطنين. تفضل بروفيسور ديفيد.
Shukran, Ahlan, Wasahlan. I'm going to talk about the rights and wrongs of surveillance. As you heard, that is the topic for today. I'm going to tell a couple of stories, and we're going to weave in some analysis in between the stories. And after I have done some speaking, then there is opportunity for questions and answers. Well, there's opportunity for questions anyway. I can't guarantee that I can answer your questions, but you may ask them anyway. Okay, first story. Now, I'm a Canadian citizen, and so I'll tell you first story from Canada. It's not a good story, I'm afraid. Last month, on a day that in Ontario is called Family Day, a Canadian family was taking a break. They were going to have a short vacation, and mother, father, and 3 kids were going to Disneyland. And so they went to the airport in Toronto, and they were going to get a flight from there to Disneyland. Popular destination for many people. And something happened as they were trying to get through the airport. It's an interesting fact, but the United States actually starts in Toronto. For those of you who think about the geography of maps and international relations, you'll be aware that old lines on maps no longer indicate exactly where borders are. So the American border is actually in the airport in Toronto. So there's your first political science conundrum for the day. So they did not get to Disneyland. In fact, they were turned back from the American border, and eventually they had to leave the airport and go back to their home. During the time, they were fingerprinted, they had their photographs taken, their documents were checked, their details were checked on the computer screen, and they were questioned, and questioned again. So, you thought this kind of world was only in Palestine, but oh no, we have it in Canada as well. And we don't like it any more than you do. Their iPads and computers were confiscated, And I don't think that they have been given those machines back yet. The parents of the family are each doctors. They work in emergency medicine in Toronto hospitals. The US officials who refused them entry told them that they didn't think that they would be returning to Canada after going to Disneyland, which is a curious assumption to make, but they thought they weren't going to return. Well, the doctors, the family name is Al-Rawi, and they hold Canadian passports, but they immigrated in 2006 via Qatar. They were worried about many things during the time that they were in the airport, as you can imagine. Not only the fact that they may not get on their vacation, not only that they weren't sure what it was that they were being stopped for, because they had made many visits to the United States before, but also the mother and daughter were particularly concerned because, being Muslims, they were worried about the fact that in their iPads and on their computers were many family photographs taken at private events when they were not covered. And so it was negative towards them as well as in the other obvious ways. They were treated as if they were not Canadian citizens. They were treated as, unfortunately, some people are treated when they are refugees or refugee claimants. They were disadvantaged in many ways. One of my PhD students back at Queen's University in Kingston is doing her dissertation on the kinds of treatment that are given to people trying to cross the Canadian border. She's actually studying the different treatment given to different people as they try to come in to Canada. These, of course, were being stopped at the American border within Canada at the airport. And my student who is doing this work has been interviewing many people and discovering just what kinds of experiences they have and how different they are if you have a brown rather than a white skin, and if you have a Muslim background as opposed to some other religious background. Or if you happen to be from, it might be country of origin as well. So the countries that are curiously named Middle East countries, Middle East from where, you might ask, these countries are often ones that also lead at least to a slowing down of the process of getting across the border. Curiously, last night in Toronto, there was a speech given by one of the political leaders in Canada, and his name is Justin Trudeau. And he was complaining about what he calls the politics of fear in Canada. And he was attacking the Conservative Party for the party in government for their treatment of Muslims at Canadian borders and in other and in immigration contexts generally, which, he said, was reminiscent of the ways that Canadians treated Jews in the 1930s and 1940s, which, by the way, was not good either, just in case you were in any doubt. So, there's my story. A family day event at the airport in Toronto that affected this particular family in a very negative way indeed. They all experienced surveillance. They have no idea what it was that prevented them going on their vacation together. And to this day, apparently, they have been given no explanation, and they haven't been given their laptops and iPads back yet. What we've been thinking about in the lectures last week and in the class that some of you are attending as students, what we've been thinking about is surveillance in today's world. Surveillance in today's world has become a huge means of power. It is both, in some senses, a source of power, but more importantly, it facilitates, it enables power. It's a channel for power. And it has become important in ways far beyond what was imagined, comments made in the introduction about George Orwell and 1984. It's a quite different kind of surveillance today, with many additional characteristics to those envisaged by George Orwell in that novel. And so, of course, being an academic, working in a university, I believe that something that has become so important in the 21st century ought to be a special study for analysis, for research, for understanding what is going on. Because it challenges many of the assumptions that we have made for decades in the social sciences, political science, geography, sociology, and other fields as well. I'm thinking of communications, for example, actually computing sciences as well. It challenges many of the assumptions that have been made, and it obliges us to ask new questions about what we mean by social power and influence and control, and, if you like, political direction. Older models of national sovereignty, of legitimate government, of the rule of law, many of these questions are thrown into confusion by the development of surveillance. So I've been trying to argue that it's a really important area for us to think about, and not only to think about, to analyze, to understand empirically, but also to assess. If you think about George Orwell, you think about top-down surveillance. You think about vertical surveillance. The state, some agencies of the state, and citizens, and the relationship between the two, and how that is affected by the gaze of the powers that be. But today we live in an era of social media and horizontal forms of digital connection that actually make a huge difference to that simple top-down model. Because in many ways, commercially enabled surveillance carries on at a horizontal level. But as we have discovered from Edward Snowden and the revelations that he has been making since June last year, it is those very interpersonal social relationships that are the source of the information that those government agencies, if you like, the top-down ones, are using. So it's no longer just top-down, but it's also across, but it is from the top that which happens across is taken in a curious kind of diagonal way, as we were thinking about with a student class yesterday. The way that personal data is used is changing as well. You may remember that I suggested we think of surveillance as any kind of focused, systematic attention to personal information for the purpose of entitlement or protection or control, management, influence, it doesn't matter what the purpose is. Obviously, it does matter in the sense that we have to analyze it, but what I'm saying is that all kinds of purposes can lie behind surveillance, and we need to understand that there are many different sorts of surveillance that operate simultaneously, and sometimes that draw on each other. So the data collected for, I don't know, if you're checking into Wikipedia or Amazon.com or Google or Facebook, those kinds of data are being used, that were collected for commercial purposes, are being used for policing purposes and for national intelligence purposes. So data about us from all kinds of sources may be used in all kinds of ways. It's a very different world from that which someone like George Orwell once imagined. Also, as I say, it isn't just government agencies anymore. Surveillance is being done by corporations. It's being done on consumers as well as on citizens. And so agencies change as well. And of course, they have a relationship with each other. When in the United States after 9/11, they invented this new thing called the Department of Homeland Security, you would have thought that an agency set up to try to find who might be likely future terrorists would go to the CIA or the FBI, okay, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and so on. They would go to policing agencies who have long experience, or intelligence agencies who have long experience of trying to find such people. They didn't. The Department of Homeland Security went to a different kind of organization or entity called CRM. Do you know what CRM is? Customer Relationship Management. It's what marketing people do. So the Department of Homeland Security went to marketing experts to try to understand who might be likely terrorists. So you see, the relationship between these consumer corporations and the agencies of state surveillance could not be closer. It is something that has developed over several decades, and now they work together in a very close way. And since Snowden, we know much more about the ways in which they interact with each other. So many things are changing as we think about these new surveillance relationships. The way the data are analyzed, the way the information is used, is also changing. So once, if you had a suspect in mind, then a policing agency or a security agency could follow that person and build up a full picture, make a profile based on their actions, on their past record, on contacts that they could be seen to be making, and so on and so forth. You could have targeted surveillance of individuals on the basis of some kind of probable cause, on the basis of a sense that, yeah, this person seems to have a number of factors that are suspicious and might predispose them to some criminal or violent activity. Okay, so that was the old way of doing surveillance. You gather data on people who are already suspects for some demonstrable reason. Today, in the era of big data, the picture is changing altogether. And massive amounts of personal information are collected together. The scale is colossal in the big data world. And these are put together for analysis in quite different ways. And those data are sifted through. They are sorted and classified according to algorithms in the software according to statistical techniques, and so quite different way of approaching this business is being developed. And this has huge implications for the kinds of surveillance that is occurring, and huge implications for the ways in which that surveillance might be responded to. And it's that response that interests me particularly this afternoon. How do we respond to these things? I've said that I'm in the social sciences. Years ago, I would have said I was an historian, because I got my PhD in a department of history. And then I started teaching sociology and started identifying as a sociologist. But then I started doing surveillance studies, and my friends turned out to be in political science and international relations and communications and computing science. And so I don't know who I am anymore. Oh, and law, of course. The law faculty at Queen's invited me to be a professor there, although I have no qualifications whatsoever in law. So, which also means there is hope for you students. You can end up somewhere with no qualifications at all and be a professor of something. It's a crazy world. Anyway, I am a professor of law with no qualifications. So, you can be encouraged if you like. But it's not just analysis in the social sciences. So often when we talk about the social sciences and we talk about analysis within the social sciences, immediately we start to think about statistical methods and empirical details and how we aspire to some sort of objective way of thinking about the situation that we're describing. And I want to suggest to you that we need to get far beyond those kinds of things. Of course, we should have accurate analysis, but our analyses will not have real meaning. We won't make a difference unless those analyses are connected with a moral and ethical assessment, a moral critique, and an ethical understanding of the world in which we now live. And those ethical stances affect the ways in which we do our analysis, inevitably. Therefore, it's better if we are clear about what sorts of analysis we're doing, about where we are coming from as we do our social and political and legal analysis. Which is why when I gave the title of this lecture, it has to do with surveillance, rights and wrongs. I'm thinking of rights and wrongs, in other words, what is wrong with surveillance, what might be right with surveillance, but also it's a reference to human rights and how that moral critique can enter into the analysis that we do. We're aware of many kinds of surveillance, rights and wrongs from our historical analysis and from what we can observe in the contemporary world. If we think about surveillance, perhaps our minds turn first to situations like police states, authoritarian regimes, places like East Germany, for example, which has become a kind of classical location for thinking about Orwellian kind of surveillance. And there are some wonderful resources to help us understand what used to happen in East Germany. The movie, The Lives of Others, for example, a brilliant movie that helps us see what was going on in that police state. For the movie, they actually use the rooms where the filing cabinets were kept by the Stasi, the secret police in East Germany. And so although it's partly a fictional movie, at the same time there are real dimensions of the movie that help us understand what life was like there. Or you could think of situations in Central America or Latin America where changes in government that were orchestrated by the American CIA led to very authoritarian regimes being set up. my wife Sue and I have visited, for example, the police surveillance headquarters in Guatemala City in Central America. And although the civil conflict in Guatemala went on from the 1960s through to the early 1990s, it wasn't until 2005 when they actually discovered the police archive. And the police archive is the place where all the records were kept of how the police acted as a sort of, I don't know how you would describe them. The police that you would think you should go to if you're in trouble or if there's a crime were, in this case, the people who were doing surveillance, torture, and murder. And they did a lot of it right in the police headquarters. And there was a lot of secrecy, of course, about where this building was located. But after the end of the civil conflict in Guatemala, instead of trying to burn the records, which they did in East Germany, they tried to burn many of the Stasi records, they just left them. And so there's a huge archive today, and people are doing research to try to connect those who were disappeared and murdered with their families, so that at least the families can know what happened to them. So when we think of surveillance, sometimes we think of those extreme situations, police states, authoritarian governments, and so on. Next week in the lecture, I'm going to be saying something about colonialism and surveillance. So this afternoon, I'm not talking about the colonialism aspect, but it's hugely important to think about the ways in which colonialism has sponsored surveillance, and especially the ways that colonial powers have engaged in surveillance in the colony in ways that has tested the surveillance techniques and technologies in those contexts, and then brought them back for use in the originating country. I mentioned the CIA a few moments ago. I said I wasn't going to talk about colonialism, and I will talk about it next week. But the CIA, in the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, is a very good example, because the United States adventures in the Philippines led to the setting up of a national security agency in the Philippines, and the same person who was in charge of that national security agency in the Philippines went back to the United States to begin the CIA in the US. That's where it came from. Test it first in the, I'll call it a colony, and then bring it back home. So the relationship between surveillance and colonialism, totally fascinating and tremendously important in the history of the past couple of hundred years. But in today's world, where there are many so-called liberal democratic states around the world, we have to think in those contexts too about what is happening with surveillance. And in these, the one word that does more than any other word to stimulate the development of surveillance is security. Security is nearly always a word that is not defined. Always a difficult situation when something is happening, a word is used for it, but it's not defined. And security is something that should be positive and welcome. I mean, if you are told that you are going to be more secure, you can breathe a sigh of relief and feel that things are just a whole lot better right away. Unfortunately, there is an irony about the word security, which lies in the fact that many security devices, apparatuses, techniques actually produce fear in the very people who are affected by them, and a sense of insecurity. It's a paradox, but it's one that is very common in our world. Lucia Zedner, criminologist at the University of Oxford, has written some brilliant things, I think, about security as propelling surveillance in today's world. And she says that security is often like an errant fire truck, like a fire truck that is out of control, that it's got its lights flashing and the horn is blaring, and it drives through the city streets in such a way as actually to endanger the lives of those who are on the street. And she says that that is what security is often like today. It's apparently doing what it should do, but it actually endangers the very lives of others. She says that ideas of urgency and the high priority given to security stifle debates over what appropriate priorities might be, stifle debates over resources and how they should be apportioned, stifle debates over countervailing interests than whatever the security is supposed to represent. Invoking security tends to close off debate about the wisdom of some policy or about the necessity of the measures that are being proposed. So security is a tremendously important driver of surveillance, despite the fact that usually it is not defined, and if it is, it's defined by some qualifying word, like national. But what in the world is a national security? What is it? What is this nation that has to be secure? There are many problems with that kind of approach to surveillance. But what it means is that managing risk through using information has become a key in policing, national security, surveillance of all kinds. Everyone is targeted. Do you know what an oxymoron is? Well, that's an oxymoron. Everyone is targeted. A target should be something that is specific and you aim for that thing. But if everyone is a target, then how can it be targeting? Everyone is targeted in the new era of mass surveillance. And then people are sort of made up people. Surveillance is now trying to capture the profile, not the person. So people are affected by the kinds of surveillance I've been describing, but it's a profile that is being sought. So today, mass surveillance affects everyone, as we know very clearly now from Edward Snowden. There's a new urgency over the debate over the rule of law. For example, the presumption of innocence is very questionable today. If you are suspected of something that you might do in the future, then what use is a presumption of innocence, that you are innocent until proven guilty? Because you are already assumed to be guilty if you are a suspect according to a profile or a classification. So what happens to the rule of law in circumstances like that? Democracy is also in question. As I've just been saying about security, debate is very often closed off using words like security in many countries. I can imagine which countries you're thinking about, but it happens in many countries around the world, which is why I was arguing in class the other day, we need to have more comparative analysis to see how we have issues in common for analysis and critique between and as well as within countries. He raises questions about human rights, as I'm going to say in a moment, and it has chilling effects as well. It helps to prevent people from openly discussing things in the public sphere. There's a piece in the New York Times today about the ways in which Wikipedia users, and particularly the people who contribute to Wikipedia, which can be anyone, of course, have their activities traced by the National Security Agency in the United States. So the very entity which helps us understand things, we go to Wikipedia to try to find some interpretation, some explanation, some definition. But you're supposed to be able to be anonymous when you make contributions to Wikipedia, for obvious reasons. There may well be negative aspects of a particular kind of contribution. But it's gone. And Wikipedia is currently suing the NSA over what is happening because the data of their users is being systematically used by the NSA. So what sorts of ethical resources can we bring into the picture? What can we say in situations like this? We need to know why surveillance matters. We need to know why we should care about it. We need to know how other people are affected, and of course about how we are affected. And of course it's no use just saying, well, we've done nothing wrong, so we have nothing to fear. That is a typical phrase used by those who are encouraging the development of security-oriented surveillance. It isn't true, for the reasons that we've been discussing in the class, mainly that surveillance classifies us, puts us in groups, and it's not what we have done that puts us in that group. It's our likeness to others in the same group. And so it's not, it's our classification, not our conduct, that counts. So what are today's priorities? Well, I've been saying in the talks that I've been given that we need to raise questions about the transparency and accountability of agencies that are engaged in surveillance activities. But we also, from the logic of what I was saying about horizontal surveillance, we should also be questioning how we use social media and our cell phones. Because what we do in everyday life contributes to how those data are constructed and how profiles are made. So we have a responsibility, we all do. Governments and corporations all the time are trying to manage our visibility. And the situation has been created where we are much more visible to organizations than organizations are visible to us. We don't know what they are doing, but they sure know an awful lot about what we're doing. So they're managing our visibility in new ways, and that is a point at which we need to raise questions. Privacy discourses have changed a lot in the last 25 years. And it's exciting to see the development in an area like privacy. Because once upon a time, privacy was a concept that was being used in very individualistic, legal, abstract ways. Over the past 20 years, more and more people have been using privacy in a way that shows that it is a public good, that it's a social good, that it's a common good. Using privacy not in relation to abstract models of what human beings might be doing, but to real embodied people engaging in their everyday practices. There's much more openness within privacy discourses today. And again, I was telling students yesterday about the privacy commissions in Canada, and actually in some ways commending them as a good way of organizing information in a digital era, where you have independent people who can take complaints, act as ombuds people in between the citizen and the agencies that collect our data. So I was commending the Canadian model of privacy commissions, and I think it's worth thinking about those kinds of ways of defending the human rights to privacy and related rights like freedom of information and association and expression. Human dignity is at stake. We're talking about something pretty fundamental here, pretty important for our everyday lives and for any kind of democratic future. It's what people are worth as human beings, before any classification on ethnic or gendered or country of origin or whatever other kind of distinction. It's what people are worth as human beings, which is the basis for human rights. We have a right to be respected as human beings. Fair treatment of everyone in the same way is what lies behind human flourishing. And I don't mean consumer individualist flourishing. I mean human flourishing as societies. Zygmunt Bauman, who is a colleague in sociology and very famous for many of his writings, has always argued that the social sciences should be imbued with ethical purpose and not be seduced by statistics and empirical study. Those things are important, and he has done them himself. But he says they should be in the context of some larger purpose, that is, an ethical purpose. These are very basic kind of ethical starting points. But I want to tell you my second story, and this will draw my talk to a close. I want to tell you my second story. This is not a story about Canada. This is a story that took place much closer to here. It's a story that resonates with all the major world religions. I'm thinking of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's a story that each of the three has as a very important moment in their religious self-understanding. So it's an important story. I am a Christian from a Christian tradition, and so you'll hear one version of it, but it's the same story, and it has the same important message for us in the world of ethics. So the story really centers on someone who was called Hagar. And Hagar was an Egyptian, as it happens. Yesterday, one of the students reminded me of the ways in which the eye of God is often used in a kind of surveillance context, perhaps for moral scrutiny or even for social control. And certainly in medieval Europe, the idea of the eye of God watching everyone was very strongly used, and in my view, wrongly used, as a means of moral control. Abraham and Sarah lacked a child. Sarah was barren and couldn't have children, or didn't think she could have children. She, according to the custom of the time, suggested that Abraham, her husband, should go to her servant, Hagar, in order to have a child and perpetuate the family name. And when the union between these two was successful, then the trouble began. Because Sarah got jealous of Hagar and acted out her jealousy. Hagar couldn't take it any longer. And one day she decided that she would run. So she became an escapee. She was a runaway. And this made her extremely vulnerable. She was vulnerable because she was a woman in a patriarchal culture. She was a runaway who had been a servant and who had gotten out of the family. And she was vulnerable because among those with whom she was living, she was a foreigner. She was an Egyptian. The intersection of three crucial vulnerabilities, all in one woman, Hagar. Well, what happened? She went out into the desert, and she was met by someone who she took to be a messenger from God. And the messenger said to her, what are you doing here? And she explained. And the messenger said, well, there's a couple of things I have to say to you. One, you really should go back to Abraham and Sarah. That probably didn't sound like very good news to her, but so be it. And the messenger also said, well, actually, the son that you're going to have, because he's going to be a son, is going to be the father of a great nation. And his name will be Ishmael. And this son is going to be an independent survivor. He'll be characterized by independence and his capacity to survive, as with those of the great nation that he will father. So that's what happened. And you were wondering to yourself, okay, what is this Canadian professor talking about? What has this got to do with surveillance? Well, then the most astonishing part of the story happens. I don't know exactly where you'll find it in your scriptures, but in the Christian scriptures, we would call it Genesis chapter 16. There you can check it out. What happened next was astonishing. The only time in the Bible, that is to say the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, okay, the Christian Bible, the only time in the Christian Bible when a woman names God occurs. And Hagar says, I encountered, let's say, the God who sees. And there's your surveillance connection. The God who sees is not the God of moral control and the God who is trying to scare us by the fact that this God can see everything we do. That may be true, but the point is that this God is the God who noticed her, paid attention to her. Remember, she was a sort of intersectional, vulnerable person. She was a female, a fugitive, and a foreigner. And across those three intersections, she was seen. And that was the important thing. And so she was thrilled. She was delighted. And so she, the only woman ever to do this, named God, the God who sees, the God who noticed, the God whose gaze was just. And that, I think, is a very interesting, it's just one area, just one source, one resource that can be used for thinking about an ethic of surveillance. But it seems to me that it's a critical one because, as I say, it comes out of something that has a resonance for all three world religions, for one thing. That's pretty big. And it's one that clearly speaks to the very situation that I described in the story from Canada at the beginning. Remember, there were women and men. The women were disadvantaged. They were treated as if they were less than citizens. So they were treated as if they were foreigners. It begs the question as to whether foreigners should really be treated differently from citizens, but you understand it's in the context of a story. And all those vulnerabilities are also visible at Pearson Airport in Toronto. And my argument would be that we need to find ethical resources. You may not like my story, But stories like that and ethical resources that come from ancient wisdom seem to be really important for finding ways of questioning what's going on in the world of surveillance today. And so, there you have it. The vision, we've been talking in class a little bit about the panopticon and the way in which the gaze of the panoptic objectifies, turns the person into an object. Today's digital panopticon, if you like, creates someone out of lots of bits of data, creates a profile rather than a person. So that objectifying gaze that comes out of that technically enhanced form of surveillance is there. But it doesn't mean that other kinds of gaze are not possible. Other kinds of gaze are possible. Vision does not necessarily blind us to the humanity of the other. So in my quest for an ethic of surveillance, I find texts like this one that I just told you about, and one can think of others as well, very helpful for reorienting, recalibrating the way that we think about surveillance in the first place. And I think in that story that I told you, there is what we might call an optics of hope. And it seems to me that we very much need an optics of hope. Because in our world, as in the world of George Orwell, there is a tremendous tendency to think, oh my gosh, things are just getting from bad to worse. We have worst case scenarios. We have dystopias. We have descriptions that are entirely negative and just fill us with fear and dread and make us just want to go into a little hole and hide away from it all. And it seems to me that that's an entirely inappropriate way to go. Paranoid approaches, complacent approaches, these things do nothing to make any change in the world. What we need is, especially in the university, analysis that is fueled by ethical critique, ethical demands, and looks not just at what the worst case scenario is going to be, but also says, well, what kind of a world would we like to see? And then works towards that. And by the way, if you do look at any of the Edward Snowden pieces that are online, you can find them freely. There are many Edward Snowden live streaming events that are now online for anyone to watch. You will find that he frequently asks that question. Although he tells us some things about the way that surveillance is going and that there are things that we had no idea were happening until he and his documents showed the evidence for them, he says, think about what kind of society we actually want. Have an ethical perspective. Develop our analysis and our policies in relation to that ethical perspective. And so I actually find Snowden as an inspiration here, because he does just that. Paranoia leads to paralysis. Complacency leads to a kind of hopelessness. We can revive memories when we're thinking about change. We can revive memories and say, well, nobody thought the Berlin Wall was going to fall, but it did fall. Nobody thought that apartheid was going to end in South Africa, but it did end. And then we can add in other signs of hope and say, well, yes, there are these opportunities here. There are things that we can do. So, in the end, whether or not you like my Eye of God story is up to you. But I think we need to look for those resources that help us, that contribute to what I call an optics of hope, rather than an optics of fear and of despair. This, it seems to me, is a much better way forward. Shukran lakum.
شكرا جزيلا للبروفيسور ليون على هذه المحاضرة الرائعة والفاسينيتنج really. بدي أحاول أنا يعني بكل تواضع أني بس أذكر لغرض الأسئلة ببعض الأمور اللي تم طرحها. البروفيسور ليون بدأ الموضوع بقصة من الواقع والحاضر ونهاها بقصة من التاريخ القديم لعبر نحن من خلال المحاضرة نستقيها من هذه القصص، على أساس إنه نحن مش عارفين، بطلنا عارفين مين إحنا، هل نحن أفراد أم مواطنون؟ لأنه باسم الأمن security كلنا أصبحنا مشتبه فينا، باسم الأمن باسم السكيورتي كلنا أصبحنا مذنبين حتى تثبت براءتنا، على عكس القيم الليبرالية الديمقراطية المعمول فيها أنت بريء إلى أن تثبت إدانتك. فهنا في عندك عكس تماما للصورة اللي يجب أن تكون. أصبحنا بدل مواطنين وبدل أفراد أصبحنا بروفايلز في كمبيوتر يمكن يخرب، بس who cares؟ كويس؟ والسؤال التالي هو: أين الأخلاقيات التي تحكم هذه السلوك؟ ما هو نظام الأخلاق؟ ما هو النظام القيمي الذي يحكم سلوكنا كمراقبين وكمراقبين في هذا العالم؟ أين المسؤولية من أجل الرقابة على هذه العملية اللي تنفذ من أجل الأمن أو باسم الأمن؟ هذه العبارة اللي لا المراقب ولا المراقب قادر يفسرها أو يعرفها، ولكن من واجبنا أن نضلنا واقفين على رؤوس أصابع إجرينا وما نيأسش، ونحاول أن نأخذ عبر من الحاضر كما من الماضي، من أجل أن نبعث الأمل في واقعنا، أنه فيش رقابة، لازم نسوي رقابة. عدم اليأس هو تقريبا النصيحة اللي بتختزل النصيحة الطويلة اللي قدمها بروفيسور ليون. شكرا جزيلا مرة ثانية للدكتور ليون. الآن بنفتح المجال للأسئلة لمدة نصف ساعة إذا تكرمتم. أرجو أن تكون الأسئلة مباشرة قصيرة وواضحة ليتسنى للأستاذ الفاضل أنه يجاوب عليها. تفضل. To answer each question. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor. Of course, my name is Fouad Abudaya, and I have a very simple, direct question. Now, you've mentioned that history was basically a kind of surveillance. It wrote down what people did, but it didn't tell us back then, right? It told us in the present time. So, my question is surveillance a necessity for every successful government? Because if you go as far back as Egyptians, you mentioned the all-seeing eye of God. And if you look back as recent as today, you look at the CIA and the American government. So it seems that if you connect the dots, it was almost priority. But nobody looked up to it, if my question was clear.
Yeah, your question is clear indeed. Thank you. Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I think for those who... the more intense our experiences of everyday surveillance, the more difficult it is for us to conceive of a situation where surveillance could be a good thing. And I think that can be repeated in several of the contexts that I was describing earlier on, if you think about East Germany or Guatemala or wherever. So let me say that before I answer the question, because I'll just repeat that. The more intense our experience of everyday surveillance, the more difficult it is to imagine a world where surveillance might not be such a bad thing. I happen to take the view that surveillance is as old as human history, and that in its earliest forms, where, for example, you would have a watcher who was appointed from within the village or from within the town to watch out for danger of all kinds, changing weather, approach of an enemy, someone stealing the crops or the herds from outside the village, whatever it was. Such entities are the precursors of, by the 18th century, what came to be professional policing, and by the 20th century was developing into sophisticated forms of surveillance and surveillance agencies. But I think their precursors lie in the city or village watcher who was appointed and who took turns with others to watch the city. And of course you could do that badly, you could do that inappropriately, you could do it for money, for example, or for power. There were all sorts of ways in which that role could be subverted. And in fact, seeing as we were talking about the Old Testament also has stories about watchers who did their watching inappropriately. But that doesn't mean that the task itself is necessarily an inappropriate or socially negative one. So I take the view that surveillance is, I've said this before, but surveillance is always ambiguous. It is never good in itself. It is never bad in itself. But it is never, ever neutral. There is no neutral surveillance. Every surveillance has to be assessed ethically, has to be brought to the bar of moral judgment. So that's what I'd say, that I don't think it's possible, I don't think it's necessarily the case that somehow all surveillances are negative or bad. I think there are good roles for surveillance, and even someone like Edward Snowden, who we now know as the person who was once working for the National Security Agency in the United States, well, let's remember that he was once working for the NSA. He did work for the NSA, and he thought that what he was doing was not inappropriate. He believed in what he was doing until he discovered that the system that he was in was systematically breaking the rules of the organization and, as it turned out, violating laws of the United States. Even that is debatable. There is still a debate going on, but the debate in part has taken away from that basic fact that Snowden was working for an agency that, in principle, he thought was worthwhile. So yeah, I think there are possibilities for surveillance that are good and worthwhile, but as I say, it's very hard to hear that in contexts where surveillance is felt very intensely.
But there's another side to the question.
Well, we should just wait and see if other people have questions. We can talk afterwards, but let's see if there are other questions first. Sorry, you're in charge, really, not me.
كيف ممكن نعتبر المراقبة ونحاكمها بشكل أخلاقي إذا كانت هي ممارسة من قبل السلطة أو الدولة للهيمنة على الإنسان، وهي يمكن اعتبارها عقاب للأشخاص يعني كما العنف المادي. لا يمكن محاكمة أخلاقيا، لأنه في النهاية هي عمليا للسيطرة على الإنسان، وهي تطور، يعني إذا يمكن اعتبارها تطور تاريخي لأساليب السيطرة والعقاب.
Yeah, so surveillance today, as I've tried to explain in the talk that I was giving, has an awful lot to do with the motif of control. And surveillance, as it were, creates certain kinds of suspects, creates certain kinds of citizens, creates certain kinds of consumers. If you take the perspective of Michel Foucault, for example, then surveillance is very closely bound up with what in your classes you will come across as governmentality, modes of governance and control. And that is certainly the case. I'm not denying that for a moment. All that I was saying in answer to the first question was that however much surveillance may be bound up with modes of control that may be negatively construed, and from which there may be a desire to escape or to at least mitigate the negative effects of surveillance, that it seems to me doesn't mean that there aren't possibilities for surveillance that is conducted under quite different motifs, not the control motif, but something closer to the critical ethics of care, so a care motif rather than a control motif. I mean, you might answer, well, of course, even a care motif can be subverted and can be used in ways that are negative for the individual. I totally agree with you. But that doesn't, I mean, if we discount the possibility of any kind of agency, especially in the world that we live in today, you have to remember that we already live in a digital era, then it seems to me what we should be looking for is ways of humanizing what is there, ways of creating different kinds of relationships, even within the digital era. So, yeah, I agree with you. The key motifs of contemporary surveillance tend to be ones that I think should be construed very critically indeed. But that doesn't seem to me to exclude the possibility of other modes of surveillance that are not inappropriate by the same criteria.
Yeah, Dr. Lyon, from your perspective, just I want to ask, you mentioned that everyone is targeted by surveillance, and under national security. How to prevent, or if you have any tools to prevent, to let everyone be not targeted by surveillance. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I've quite understood the question.
I'm asking that you mentioned in your lecture that everyone is targeted by the surveillance.
Yeah.
How to prevent that to be everyone being a target?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
You.
So yeah, now I think I understand. So how do we raise questions about the mass surveillance and the targeting of everyone? Well, you know what? We can go to the products of empirical research and show just how far, at a very basic level, the technologies that are being used are actually successful. And so, for example, during the past year, 2014, there were 2 American government reviews that were instigated by the White House, by the President, that were reviews of the National Security Agency and their effectiveness. And I've forgotten the actual figure, but the actual proportion was of success stories of using big data-based mass surveillance in apprehending or predicting whether there was going to be some kind of terrorist attack. The number of times that happened is negligible. It's very hard to find evidence that all these big data, billions of dollars being put into huge big data practices, sophisticated computer technologies, and so on and so forth. It's very difficult to show that they actually work. However, if you look at the news stories of how people are apprehended or how terror cells are discovered, then usually you will read that it is through old-fashioned policing methods. That is to say, the use of informers, the development of a suspect profile, the systematic following of specific individuals, and so on and so forth. The kinds of things that were developed in police and your criminology textbook examples from decades. And so there's a very straightforward answer, I think, to that, which is that we can bring those kinds of examples to the debate and say, well, these methods do not seem to be working. And yet, look at the evidence of when criminal activity or potentially violent activity or terrorist activity has actually been stopped, or there's been a signal before some event. It's through old-fashioned methods. So I think at a very basic level we can ask whether it works or not. And I think it's interesting that it actually came out of presidential reviews in the United States. Some of them are also included in the... It's a book from Princeton University Press called The NSA Report. And it's a multi-authored report on NSA activities. And it's very critical of the mass surveillance methods being used. And it also connects civil liberties and privacy. And says that you can never drive a wedge between them. So there's some very interesting public domain materials that really raise basic questions about what the NSA and related agencies in many countries around the world, not just the NSA, is doing.
أهلا بروفيسور ليون. حسب ما أنا فهمت أن الرقابة موجودة في كل مجالات الحياة. في الأسرة الوالد يراقب الأبناء، في الدائرة، في الوزارة، في الحكومة، في المصنع، في كل مكان. 3 مفردات أرجو أن تجد وتوضح العلاقة بينهم. القانونية، قانونية الرقابة، شرعية الرقابة، العدالة. في حالة توفر العدالة هل نحتاج إلى الرقابة السلبية؟ وحسب ما فهمت بأنه في رقابة إيجابية وفي رقابة سلبية. تفضل بروفيسور.
The link between those 3 concepts? Okay. So we're talking about legitimacy and justice and one other. But yeah, I think we have to say that there are links between them. And I'm glad that you brought up the question, too, of the relationship between different kinds of surveillance in different contexts. Because from the definition that I gave you earlier, it's clear that surveillance can take place in many different contexts. If we're thinking about the what you might call the apparatus of surveillance, or the intentions of surveillance as well. So yeah, I think that those always have to be linked, but I would put the justice question first. I mean, that would be the first one, because as you heard me say, it seems to me that surveillance has to be judged by criteria that relate to justice, which I take to be part of human flourishing. So if we say that if we answered Snowden's question and said, the world we are looking for, the world that we would like to live in, not this world of mass surveillance, not this world of inappropriate, excessive, illegal, or whatever else surveillance, the world that we want to live in is one in which we can all flourish as human beings in every aspect of our lives. That, it seems to me, is what justice means in relation to human flourishing, in relation to humanity. And of course the question of relationality is there too. If you have a society that is ruled by a hermeneutic, a mode of interpretation, of suspicion, then how can you expect there to be mutually trusting relationships? So I would say that the basis of any institution like surveillance ought to be one that has that justice and care as a road to human flourishing. The legality question, well, obviously that changes from legal code to legal code, but if there is to be surveillance as an institution within a society, then it seems to me that it must always operate within the agreed bounds of what is legal. And that's why we have the questions about the NSA in the US. Its legitimacy should be demonstrated by the way in which the institutions of surveillance are answerable to those who are under surveillance. That is to say, there should be accountability and transparency. We who are being surveilled should know what is being done by those who are doing the surveillance, and their activities, because they are part of the governmental apparatus, their activities should be accountable to the people. We should be able to see what's going on. They should be accountable to us. And in that way, I think there's the connection. The third one, again, to come at it the other way around, the justice question comes out of that. But I would see the justice in the context of human flourishing in every way, because then you don't simply limit it to some notion like national surveillance, which covers, makes opaque, veils all sorts of other activities. So the quest for economic dominance, for example, we've seen from the Snowden revelations that an awful lot of surveillance that goes on is of corporations by corporations, sometimes of corporations by governments. The Canadian government, for example, was shown to be obtaining information about mining operations in Brazil. So that's why there has to be a certain openness about the ways in which this is occurring, and therefore the justice question is one that depends on what was previous, legitimacy, where everything can be seen clearly and where there is accountability, and then in the first place legality. And of course the legality has to change. We live in a digital era. We need to think in terms of laws that are appropriate for a digital era. We need to think about laws and rules and regulation for the internet, which is a crucial area for public debate. So in all these ways, yes, I think the three concepts are linked, and it's really important to have all three of them together.
يعطيك العافية. يبدو أنه فيش أسئلة وخلص الوقت، انتهى الوقت. كنت بدك تسأل؟ عفوا. ماشي. هلا أعتقد أنه في بريك لحين أنه موعد التدريب للطلاب اللي نعم. شكرا بروفيسور ليون once again. يعطيكم العافية. شكرا للحضور.
And ask our own questions from earlier. We have a new student with us this afternoon, and this is Kelly Whitty. She is from the Canadian office in Ramallah, and so she is a political agent. And I welcomed her to come if she wanted to come today, so she can spend a few minutes with us as a student with you. I'm pretty sure not, but you know, you can never tell. there you have it. Okay, so there may be all kinds of places where you want to start. I know that Khalil wanted to bring us a couple of comments from the Palestinian Constitution that raises questions about surveillance and how it is construed and regulated. So do you want to start, Khalil? Oh, you need the mic. Yep, fine. Which won't be good for me. That's fine.
The first, I want to say that there is many articles in our constitution about the human rights and freedom. The first one, المادة 11 11.1 الحرية الشخصية حق طبيعي وهي مكفولة ولا تمس. هاي المادة الأولى، المادة 11. المادة الثانية اللي بتحكي وفي هناك إشارة مباشرة لموضوع المراقبة هي المادة 17 للمساكن حرمة فلا تجوز مراقبتها أو دخولها أو تفتيشها إلا بأمر قضائي مسبب ووفقا للأحكام القانون، ويقع باطلا كل ما يترتب على مخالفة أحكام هذه المادة، ولمن تضرر إجراء ذلك إنه تضرر جراء ذلك ذلك الحق في التعويض عادل تضمنه السلطة الوطنية الفلسطينية. هناك في تعويض للي بيتعرض للأذى أو للمراقبة من قبل جهة غير مكفولة بالقانون أو بحكم أو بأمر قضائي. في عندنا المادة كمان 19 لا مساس بحرية الرأي، ولكل إنسان الحق في التعبير عن رأيه ونشره بالقول أو بالكتابة أو غير ذلك من وسائل التعبير أو فن أو الفن مع مراعاة أحكام القانون. ومن هاي المادة ممكن نحكي على السوشيال ميديا إنها هي مساحة شخصية مثل الفيسبوك، إن أنت بتحدد بالضبط من الأشخاص اللي أنت بتحطهم داخل هذه الدائرة حتى أنت تعبر عن رأيك. فهون كمان ممكن سند قانوني إنه عدم الأخذ بالفيسبوك من أجل أي قضية قضائية بخصوص حرية الرأي. وفي بالنهاية في المادة 27.3 في كمان اللي هي بتحكي عن حرية الصحافة about the media. تحظر الرقابة على وسائل الإعلام ولا يجوز إنذارها أو وقفها أو مصادرتها أو إلغائها أو فرض قيود عليها إلا وفقا للقانون وبموجب حكم قضائي. في النهاية نحكي بخصوص الإجراءات أو الاعتداءات على الحريات. في المادة 32 من القانون الأساسي أو الدستور الفلسطيني كل اعتداء على أي من الحريات الشخصية أو حرمة الحياة الخاصة للإنسان، وهو بنركز على الحياة الخاصة للإنسان private life and personal life وغيرها من الحقوق والحريات العامة التي يكفلها القانون الأساسي أو القانون، جريمة لا تسقط الدعوى الجنائية ولا المدنية الناشئة عنها بالتقادم. هذه مهمة جدا، لا تسقط الدعوى الجنائية ولا المدنية.
The thing is that most of the constitutional articles that he stated, first of all, I want to emphasize that the Palestinian Basic Law is not the strongest document to rely on because it has many flaws. As a law student, I say so. Regardless of this fact, I say that we notice that most articles say that this and that freedom is guaranteed, but is to be organized or to be organized, by a law. So we can't say that this freedom of X is guaranteed when we notice that a law can organize it. Obviously, this opens the door for many interpretations, for many obstacles, for many other ways that the public authority can act through bylaws, which would not be unconstitutional, which would not be illegal, which would be very much credible for the public authority to limit certain freedoms or to act based on surveillance through laws. So those are not really the most let's say, the strongest things that we can rely on when we want to guarantee certain freedoms for people.
Okay. Anybody else want to make a comment? Yeah, sure. Sasha? Go ahead.
هو فعليا صحيح اللي بيحكي انه في مثلا سلطه الضبط الاداري، مصطلحات برضه وردت بالقانون زي ما نحكي النظام العام، هاي المصطلحات الفضفاضه اللي برضه زي ما يعني في قوانين معينه بتعطي انه ماشي نحمي الخصوصيه او خلينا نحكي الحريات العامه، في قوانين ثانيه بالعكس هي بتقيدها بمفاهيم هي بتكون كثير فضفاضه ومش معرفه بالقانون نفسه. يعني هو القانون زي ما بيكفل لك برضه بيعطي سلطه للسلطة الحاكمة أو للسلطة الموجودة إنه هي برضو تقيد سلوكك بطريقة معينة يعني. بس
Okay, we have another comment. We've obviously opened something here.
اللي حكوه الشباب هون طلاب القانون يعني أنا بتجه معهم، بس لو بدنا نفترض إنه هذا الدستور أو القانون الأساسي المطبق عنا إنه هو اسمه وثيقة وهو الإشي المطبق، لو نرجع لنصوص القانون الأساسي بنلاقيها بتحكي في حق الخصوصية بس عن شغلتين اللي هي حرمة المسكن وحرية المراسلات، ما نظمت إشي تاني، ما تطرقت لأشياء إلها علاقة بالرقابة وإلها علاقة بالحياة الخاصة، قصرتها بس على شغلتين. يعني كمان القانون الأساسي الفلسطيني اتبع نفس المنهج اللي تبعته معظم الدول العربية، نظمت الحق بالخصوصية نفس الاتجاه، حكت في الدستور بس عن هذول الحقين، هو الحق بالخصوصية والحق بالمراسلات والاتصالات فقط. وهذا يعني المفهوم هو بسيط أو سطحي، ما بيغطي التطورات، ما بيغطي الأساليب الرقابة الحديثة وتطورات التكنولوجية.
Okay, so we are... okay, Khalid, could I just have one word? So clearly there's a debate here that is of great interest to several of you, and I too think that it's important. I speak with ignorance, however, of the details of the Palestinian Constitution and of these legal measures. I think that there are several things that one could say. It's very difficult to determine what effective privacy laws are anyway. So the two that Khalil started with were one that had to do with personal freedom, and clearly personal freedom can be considered in the context of surveillance, because one of the things that being under surveillance does is even to make you feel unfree, and it may well actually constrain you from certain kinds of activities anyway. Or the knowledge about you may lead to various kinds of constraints being placed upon you, freedom of movement and so on and so forth. So the freedom of the person is one. Then you moved straight to one that had to do with the home, and I think the word was sacredness or something like that of the context of the home, which is not so much to do with freedom construed as capacity to be mobile, to move around, to do freely what you want to do. This one has to do with space. It has to do with kind of internal territory within a building, which of course is another way of construing privacy, a space in which you can be free of interference, where some agencies may not enter without legal warrant, and so on and so forth. Very common, very old idea of privacy. But I think going through your list reminds us of the ways in which privacy and related concepts are manifold and can be interpreted in many different ways. And so there is bodily privacy, the privacy of my body. There is the privacy of relationships, so who I relate with, which may also connect with privacy of communication privacy, that I should have the right to say things to other people that are not known by others, especially those that are in some kind of authority position. There are so many levels at which we can take this, and then territory, the space question of the home or some other context in which you may not enter, or which space you may not violate. So there are many dimensions of the privacy concept that have to be borne in mind. And then you finished with kind of media and communication type of privacy that had to do with engaging with others. You were suggesting that could easily be interpreted in terms of Facebook and other forms of social media. So that's yet another, that's privacy in the world that might once have been described as chatting or just conversing with neighbors or whatever. So somebody made a comment later on about the ways in which any privacy legislation and regulation needs to be updated from time to time, and that I think is a crucial comment, whoever it was who made it. Thank you. Because especially as we shift into a digital era that affects everyone globally, there needs to be far more consideration paid to the digital and to digital modes of action, activity, communication, conversation, exchange, and so on and so forth. So there is a great need to move those laws forward. I mean, there are going to be tasks for lawyers for a long time in this field. Along with people who bake bread and do other important things, lawyers may well be needed in this area. Of course, the bakers are good. We're discovering there's some really good bakeries in Ramallah, by the way. It's pretty good things being baked. Lawyers may well be needed for helping to bring the law in line with the kinds of changes that are taking place today. And I think this is a critical area. In the countries where there have been privacy and data protection laws, it's a slightly different approach. The North American tends to be more towards privacy law. The European tends to be more towards data protection. And they operate differently. But either way, they're attempting to speak to questions that relate to the proliferation of digital media, of communication. And there is a huge need for laws in every country that relate to privacy and data protection to be updated. And the current challenges from mass surveillance and social media use and so on are ones that really do demand that. And I can't really comment on the Palestinian case, but I'm glad you reminded us of local attempts to speak to these kinds of issues, because it's crucial that we try to think about them everywhere. It's also, in the world of law, we tend often to refer to precedent, and precedent only works up to a point. New situations develop that using new technologies may be unprecedented, in the sense that we haven't really experienced them in that way before. And so I think there's a great technology and law challenge to develop legal modes of regulation that actually speak to what is happening. I'm always concerned about giving examples of books that might not be in your library, but you might be able to find some pieces by this person. There is a woman at, I can't remember where she is now. Anyway, she's American. And her name is Julie Cohen, Cohen. which is one of those interesting names that occurs both in Palestinian and Jewish context. She's called Julie Cohen, and her book, Cohen, yeah. And her book is called Configuring something. Configuring the networked self. There you go. Configuring the networked self. And I don't know of any book that is better at describing in understandable language the ways in which people actually use new technologies. So many treatments that started either with the technologies themselves or started with legal systems themselves have failed to really get anywhere. Her work starts with ordinary, embodied human beings like us in our everyday relationships, using social media and interacting in ways that we really interact, not as imagined by technical techies who produce the software and so on, or by legal scholars who are still thinking about some concept from a past era that hasn't really been reinterpreted for the digital era. So have a look at Julie Cohen if you get the chance. I'm sure there must be things that are available online from her, even if you don't have her book in your library. And see what you think. I think she makes some very interesting points about these matters. Actually, I have a review of her book that is forthcoming, or maybe it's appeared in the University of Toronto Law Journal. I could give you the review, then you'd have at least a summary of the book. So if you remind me, I'll try to give an electronic copy to Jumana when she's back, and then you can at least read my summary of what I said about Julie Cohen's work in that review. You need to remind me though, because if you don't remind me, I'm likely to forget. Okay, very good. Julie Cohen, good place to go, because she's really thinking about how people actually communicate, and she is qualified in both law and has a very good sense of how the technologies work. She's a really, really very helpful resource in this area. Anyway, I don't know how we got into all those matters, but let's have a different kind of question and conversation now, shall we? I really wanted to know if there were issues that arose from the little lecture that I was giving earlier. I'm no longer... Oh, there are. You have a question? Really? When I was sitting up there, I was the professor. But I'm down here with you now, and you can be reassured that I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from, and so we can have a conversation. I really don't like the, sitting above people. Makes me seem like the surveillance agent then. But, there are. You have the floor, as they say.
I wanted to ask, basically I was thinking about when you were up there, talking about justice and legitimacy and the legal aspect of it, and how basically what I was thinking is nations, or it's pessimistic. This is a bit pessimistic, but the dependence of a society to flourish in our times depends on conquering other nations in a way. So using the surveillance in a non-moral, ethical way to gain, and that's how a state will flourish. It's an unfair game. So, how could we? Are we going to try to come up with these universal moral or standards, these bars that would protect? Because it seems like surveillance has become this mass, this world opticon. So now that it's a world opticon and it could affect other nations and states, what's like? I feel like that's a problem. Like that's a challenge. That's a challenge of like there's no ethics in politics in a way. And how do we overcome that? Like,
good. Okay. How much time have you got? I need at least an hour to answer that question properly. So, if you're okay with that, we'll just get going. Seriously. First point. An awful lot of discussion in this area does not resort to basic ethical thinking. There is so much in the kind of legal area and in the technical area that limits itself to abstractions, to calculations, to all kinds of kind of utilitarian ways of thinking, and also calculative ways of thinking that relate to the commercial value of data and so on. Huge issue. So an awful lot of the world that we've made engages in the practices that we've been describing without reference to anything beyond the calculative, the utilitarian, the individualistic, the abstract. And that's the world in which we find ourselves very often. I was arguing this afternoon that a better way, it was a better way to go about our analysis of the world in which we live, a digital world where surveillance is present everywhere and is rapidly growing, used by all kinds of organizations, and we find ourselves not only under surveillance but engaged in surveillance and providing the raw material for surveillance. So we're in that world, and my question was, well, how do we operate in this world? Do we simply share the utilitarian, abstract, disembodied, blah, 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 ways of thinking that dominate the world of the digital, that dominate the world of consumer capitalism, and so on? Or do we raise questions both in our own personal and social lives and in our studies that are informed by larger questions than the merely utilitarian, abstract, individual, and so on? Do we allow ourselves to hear other voices, or put the other way around, the voice of the other? If we're thinking about marginalized and disadvantaged people, it's not just do we hear other voices, but do we hear the voice of the other? And that's my question. And so I told two stories, one about multiple disadvantage in an experience of a family going through an airport. Okay. And clearly from the expressions on people's faces, it resonated because you understood. And then I told a story, a very ancient story from a sacred text that related to multiple disadvantage and a kind of seeing, a gaze, which is not just informed by ethical approaches, but describes a deity as seeing justly and recognizing the disadvantage, the marginalization, the vulnerability of the persons concerned. That's a kind of extreme case, but it relates directly back to my Canadian story on the American border, because those very disadvantages, the intersection of the three, the female, fugitive, foreigner, are what we experience. And so from the ancient story, that I think gives the basis or the environment or the context for an ethic the two can be put together, and you say we don't just have to look at that in terms of some security requirement or some technical requirement or what we need to do to make the airport work efficiently or whatever. We can think about this in an entirely different way. It doesn't have to be organized like that. So that was my, that's what I was saying. We don't have to study it, and we don't have to do it that way. There's nothing that obliges us to live that way, to think that way, to do our studies that way. We can listen to other voices and the voice of the other in particular. So that's where I was going. But your question says, well, it's all very well talking about that, but what about the everyday context in which we find ourselves? How do you ever do that? How do you insert or imbue these systems with such an ethic? How could that ever happen? Well, that's a very good question. And that is more of a daily engagement question and a political question. The daily engagement and political question is, I think, affecting everyone. And I think you've heard me say something like this already, that the ways in which we need to confront contemporary surveillance is not by some magic solution for everything. There is no such thing. And I certainly have not suggested that there is any such thing. Nor does it come from a blanket condemnation of everything that happens. Because some aspects of what happen, I argued this afternoon, within the surveillance world are not inappropriate, are not excessive, are not illegal, are not undesirable. That's why we have to assess, discern, critique, decide what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. Okay, so how do we do that? At every level. The kind of world that we've created, as I've tried to argue, is one that affects us in everyday life and also affects the grand, what Bauman calls extraterrestrial power, the global alliances of corporations and governments. It's huge. But it affects everyone. So at every level, it seems to me, there need to be ethical responses. You're university students. You're going to be going into these different kinds of industries, these different kinds of agencies. You're involved in law and media, political activity, and so on and so forth. At every level, different ways of thinking through the ethical and how it applies in specific instances needs to be worked out. So, you could rightly say it's all very well for you to talk about ethics and bring stories from ancient sacred texts to talk about airports in the 21st century, but how's that going to get us anywhere? Well, I think it's going to get us anywhere if people who are going into, and I know it's not you in this particular class, a group, but who are going into computing science and software development and so on, the people who are going into those areas, there are very few computer science departments anywhere in the world that teach the ethics of computing. How come? You go to medical school and you are required to think about the ethics of what you're doing because lives are at stake. When lives are at stake in the world that is affected by computing technology, how come there isn't similar ethical teaching in those areas? And when it comes to education, there's a huge need for ethical education in media education, in internet use, in how one connects with one's device and others through that device. In the area, well, I already said then that in the legal area, there's need for constant rethinking this, but real-world thinking, embodied people in relationships, which is a million miles from classical legal notions of individual atoms that are construed in very abstract ways. So, at every level, I argue, these things have to be faced. There is no single solution. There is no magic solution. There is no solution that somehow subsumes all the others. And moreover, in different fields, people will have to debate what is appropriate. So if the computing scientist has a feeling about what might be an appropriate way, let's say end-to-end encryption as a solution to keeping unwanted surveillance out of your system, well, another technical person might come along and say, well, you can't actually do end-to-end encryption anymore. Every online system is vulnerable. Every online system is insecure. What we need is to work out some other method beyond end-to-end encryption that is actually going to help us. There are groups in organizations such as Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. And they, and sometimes privacy people, work together on things like privacy by design. That is to say, designing into computer and software systems privacy-friendly kinds of features, so that you don't have to wait for somebody to come along and say, well, this is really contravening our basic data protection approach, or this is not privacy-friendly at all. The computer scientists in the first place have designed into the system ways of trying to ensure the integrity of the user and the exclusion of unwarranted surveillance. So, you know, at that level, at the educational level, in the commercial level, the marketing level, at the level of discussing national security, at every level, there's a need to think about the ethical question. So, you know, a bit of a long answer. It's not the hour I promised, but I'm not really going to go on for an hour about that. But I think it's a really good question. But I think anyone who I think is thinking appropriately in this field in a kind of social, scientific, and legal way has to acknowledge that there isn't a solution coming from one place. Every area needs to have more than that utilitarian, calculative approach. Every area needs to think about the ethics from whatever base they find those ethics. But I am convinced that there is a wide area of shared agreement on appropriate modes of behavior online and so on and so forth. There's plenty of scope for agreement on what are significant areas for ethical action. So that's the sort of answer that I would give. Is that getting anywhere close, Duran?
And I see it like everyone on his own, like everyone to himself, and we have to find, as a society, maybe as a country, to come together, you know, find the different categories, education, government, all that, come to ways of fighting, you know, the mainstream of the internet from where it's coming in. Because our vulnerabilities is their power, it's their money, it's that profit. So it's just like you have to shut down in a way to protect what you have of vulnerabilities. So it's still like the jungle. That's how I kind of see it. And I think your answer is this: basically, we have to work on ourselves from an individual base all the way up to a state base. But on an individual base, we're also facing the global alliance of government and corporation. So that's another problem. So I think what we'd have to go down to is this, as an individual, how he would have to protect, and then maybe spread out from there, to the university to somewhere else, and on.
Yeah. Okay. But I wasn't actually saying it's sort of on an individual level. Of course, we each need to make decisions about where our own ethical routing is and what we really believe about the world and other people and how we should relate to each other and what are appropriate ways of going on in commerce and technology and education and so on and so forth. Of course, we do have to make individual decisions, but I think there are lots of things that can be done together. There are many many possibilities for corporate activity, and there are many opportunities for engaging with those institutions and agencies that we're most closely associated with. You're in a university. University is a place for study, learning, research. It's a place for independent thinking. It's a place where new ideas can be developed, new solutions tested. The university itself is a location where together you can do things. And, in the 20-something years that we've been working on collaborative research in our Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's University, we've done a lot of things together. And I really enjoy the sense of solidarity with other people who are seeking similar ways forward, with colleagues and with students and research assistants and postdocs and so on. And we have a lot of fun together as well. And we trust each other quite a lot and respect each other and try not to disadvantage each other. All those things have to be done, If a professor depends on some work that a graduate student did, it's really important that the graduate student be credited with the work that was done by the graduate student. And, right at that mundane level, we have to think about how we work together in the organization. But the organization can also become exemplary. It can become an example of how to do things better. And I think the university itself can show what it is to do things better. There was a case at Queen's a few years ago when it was realized that we were asking incoming students many questions about their background and so on and so forth. And actually it was quite divisive because the kind of questions tended to favor the sorts of students who had been associated with Queen's University for many, many years, which was mainly white students. And it meant that we were, through these complicated entry questions, we were helping to perpetuate a kind of white hegemony in the university. And people started asking questions about it, and started asking, well, how many fields do we really need for people to fill in? Why couldn't we reduce the number of fields? It's called data minimization in the tech jargon, but data minimization is actually good from a commercial point of view as well, because you are dealing with less data. All these things cost money. You're dealing with less data. It requires less analytic processing power and so on and so forth. So there are actually commercial reasons. You can bring commercial reasons in to, convince the university that it's a good idea. And so data minimization can occur. And it happened. And, the NSA has this slogan, collect it all. Okay, just suck it all in. It's the vacuum cleaner approach to surveillance. Just bring it all in. Well, it's not necessary. As I was saying this afternoon about the ways in which terrorist groups have actually been found, it isn't through collect it all. Collect it all doesn't actually work for that. It works for all sorts of other purposes that are actually less desirable ones. But it doesn't work for the purpose for which it's set up in the first place. And if we did some data minimization within those surveillance agencies, that would not be a bad thing. Our university, did not collapse when we stopped collecting it all. In fact, the university continued, and in some ways, I would say, it's better, because that reduction of fields in entering students actually has contributed to a broadening of the student population at Queen's. So there's an example, something that is done with an ethically grounded motive, may also be argued for on commercial and economic terms and technical terms, and produces an outcome which is preferable ethically to what went on before. It's just a little example. But what I'm arguing is if we had the insight, if we had the imagination to engage our organizations, the ones that we're already part of, you don't have to go and join the NSA so that then you can be an Edward Snowden. You can start right here at Birzeit. And there are things that can be done here in the world of surveillance that, can engage an ethical imagination and actually make a difference. So I don't anticipate that we can change the world. And certainly not tomorrow. But there are things that we can change. And I would argue that it's worth doing those things because we're contributing to making the world a better place. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but I think it's, if we're looking for a world where there is human flourishing in every respect, then making the world a better place may be a cliche, but it refers to something worthwhile. Yeah. After the boys have finished asking questions, it'll be the turn for the girls to ask questions. So just be ready for the questions, okay?
Following on Dirar's question or comments, I personally would say that I completely agree with what you said and what he said about flourishing humanity, about the ethical aspect in surveillance. But when I try to just think about it in a more, let's say, pragmatic way or in a more realistic way, I see that when we talk about ethics, we do not talk about a certain set of rules that we have, and we just show the world that we have those sets of rules and we should use or not. If we use them, then this thing becomes ethical. If not, then it's not. The ethical question itself raises many answers, and they can all be seen as ethical answers, but sometimes they do not line in harmony together. We can find two answers, both have the point of view of ethics, but in contrast. So this would open the door for nations maybe to use surveillance, as there are said, in their own ethical way to prosper on the account of others and vice versa. So how do we get out of this paradox, let's say?
Sure. Like I say, nothing is going to be a magic solution, and nothing's going to happen overnight, and it's all going to be it's all in the context of a process of negotiation, in a process of hearing the other, developing new perspectives. On the grand scale of international relations, it still seems to me there are certain kinds of ethics that would be worth, thinking through. So I'm not an expert on that level any more than I'm an expert on law. But if you think about Clausewitz and the idea of Clausewitz that war is the continuation of politics by another means, then you could equally argue that in the 21st century we see that politics is often a continuation of war by other means. And I think if some people involved in international diplomacy recognize that, then that would make a huge difference in the world that we actually live in terms of international relations. It may sound naive, but it seems to me that there are some basic assumptions that are unethical in the ways in which we consider, what happens next. is war the continuation of politics, or are we in a situation where politics is a continuation of war? There's some basic issues there. But listen, what I'm meaning by the ethical, just to come back to what you were saying, is not really to do with rules so much as an outlook or an attitude or it's emotion. It's different. That sort of thing is quite a long way from rules. You can work out the rules and the regulations and the legal distinctions after that. But the ethical is to see ourselves as people who are, for a start, completely on the same level. We are human beings. That's the starting point. Human dignity has to do with respecting that condition. According to Levinas, and I think to a lot of scriptures around the world, the idea of finding what it is to be human, discovering our humanity through the face of the other, is a pretty good starting point, because that reminds us that we are not individual atoms. We are, if you like, inherently social beings. The way we're made is to relate to other people. Actually, in the Surveillance After Snowden book that I was writing and that will come out later this year, I talk a little bit about this in the chapter on privacy, and talk about being human, fundamentally relating to relationality, sociality. And I think it makes a huge difference in the area of surveillance and privacy to think about that basic condition. But as I say, it has to do with, well, like I say, what we are as humans. Are we brain boxes on legs, like some people think professors are? Are we... you're not fooled by that idea, I know. What are we as human beings? And I say at a very fundamental level, we're emotional, and we care about some really important things. What is it that you really care about when you're down to the wire? That you trust your friend. That when your friend does something to you that is harmful, or you think is maybe negative, you can forgive your friend. And if you trust them, then you're not automatically suspicious of them the whole time. You care for your, classmates, friends, whatever it is, such that if they're in trouble in some way, you're there for them. I mean, these are simple, basic things, but that's what I think of as the basics for ethics. What's his name? Okay, American writer. His name will come back to me, but he said that justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. And I think there's a brilliant connection there between relationality, love, care for the other, forgiveness, and how that works out at a kind of extra-personal level in the social political realm. Justice is what love looks like in public, and I still can't remember the name of the guy so that I can send you to read his work. It'll come back to me, and when it does, I'll write it down to remind myself. But that sort of thing is what I'm meaning by ethics. And then after we've thought through that very basic level, I'm inviting you to think about some basic things to do with our common humanity and human flourishing, and then saying, okay, how does that work out in relation to some ethic for privacy or for the limitation on surveillance? And then how could that actually be encoded in some legal formula? How could it be built into some technical system? How could it become the feature of the organization in which we live and work? So, do you see what I'm saying? It's not a set of rules. If it's to do with the basic humanity and the ethic that relates to that, then we're asking a whole series of questions that all too frequently are missing from the social sciences, as they are from some technical sciences and economic and marketing sciences. But I think they're indispensable, and I'd argue for them. Sorry? You got it. You Googled it. Thank you. Cornell West, exactly. And, yeah, so now you can go and read Cornell West and find out about justice is what love looks like in public. Very good. Okay. How are we doing? Oh, yes, that's right, of course. It's end of boys' turn, beginning of girls' turn.
لما نحكي عن الأخلاق في سياق الحديث عن الرقابة ونوصل لمرحلة إنه إحنا نقرر إنه نحط قواعد أخلاقية لنحد مثلا من التعدي على خصوصية شخص معين. بس أنا بشوف الأخلاق على إنها إشي نسبي. يعني مثلا اللي أنا شايفته أخلاقي مش ضروري هي أو أنت أو أي حدا تاني يشوفه أخلاقي. مثلا في الحالة الفلسطينية خلينا ناخذ مثال إنه مثلا الحكومة الفلسطينية مثلا بتستخدم أشياء بنشروها الناس على الفيسبوك عشان تعتقلهم أو هيك. ممكن أنا ما أشوفه إشي أخلاقي، بس هم الحكومة أو أي حدا ممكن إنسان تاني إنه يشوفه لا عادي لازم هيك، لأنه هم بتعدوا على سلطة، بتعدوا على بيعملوا فوضى في البلد وهذا الحكي. فبدي أوصل لمرحلة إذا السلطة مثلا شايفة إنه هذا الإشي أخلاقي وأنا مش شايفته أخلاقي، ما بقدر أمنعها تعمل هيك أو تتعدى على خصوصيتي. كيف بدي أعالج هاي النقطة نسبية الأخلاق في موضوع الرقابة؟
Well, as I say, that's a great question. The ethical sphere is always one in which we have to debate and argue about what is an appropriate way forward. Nothing that I have said this afternoon is meant to be taken as a justification for what I think of as very negative forms of surveillance. So I think that the sorts of things that I've been saying could contribute to a complete condemnation of a number of security agencies that exist around the world. And this may include the security agencies that you have confronted. And I have no sympathy with them. I don't believe that they are appropriate. I think that in the case of, in our own country, in Canada, the Communications Security Establishment that works with the National Security Agency of the United States is doing many things that are unethical, inappropriate, sometimes illegal, and I think that we have to stand up and argue against them. So, nothing that I've said will should be used to say that, well, it's just a different way of thinking about these things. I think we can demonstrate that they fall short of appropriate standards of data limitation, data minimization. They fall short of, the kind of positive discrimination that I think is demanded by the kind of ethic for surveillance that I was suggesting under the optics of hope. Because that says that the responsibility of any governing authority is primarily to those who are most likely to be disadvantaged and negatively treated. It's a pretty different criteria from the kinds of criteria that you hear operating on borders and at checkpoints and in security agencies. But I start from a completely different place. And that completely different place is that all agencies of government have a primary responsibility to care for the most vulnerable members of society. That's my starting point. But I think we can argue it, and we can argue it on all kinds of grounds. We can have it as an ethical starting point, but we can show that it is economically inappropriate to disadvantage certain groups in the population. We can show that it causes social breakup, the end of social cohesion, to operate in a particular way. We can show that the disadvantages to the already marginalized groups increase if we continue these policies. So there are all kinds of ways of arguing for it, not only directly ethical ones. And so, yeah, I think there are times when clearly it's very difficult for us to answer back to those who are in a position of authority or power over us. Totally agree. And, that's a situation of great frustration. But where there are opportunities, I think they still can be taken. And we can speak about some things. And sometimes, as I say, we can strategically use other kinds of arguments to make the point that we really want to make. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we're making arguments that will be understood by those with whom we are arguing, even though our motivation or the context from which we come is much bigger than this level of the argument that we come to. So yeah, I think there are. There's always going to be negotiation. There's always going to be argument about which ethics are appropriate. My case this afternoon is to say that we ought to be engaging at the ethical level, not only at some spurious notion of security, for example, or some technical idea that we have to collect all the data we possibly can. It simply isn't the case. But you can make the argument on grounds that are, if you like, sub-ethical. They're not at that level. They're at the level of, it would be cheaper to do it this way than that way. Or it would be more beneficial to the population if we do it this way than that way. So there are other ways of making the argument, and there's nothing illegitimate about that. So, but I hope you don't think that I'm not understanding what it is to confront agencies that are very negatively disposed to individuals, and particularly individuals from particular groups. I'm not. I hope the examples that I gave from East Germany and Guatemala and so on show that, everything in me revolts against the illegitimate and overbearing kinds of authority that can be expressed through surveillance agencies. But I think it's a social evil that needs to be confronted at a social level. It's a political wrong that needs to be confronted politically. And it's something that has to be done, as I was saying to Derar, together. There are opportunities, and where there are opportunities, I think they can be taken. How are we doing? Still got a few minutes if you want to ask. Yeah. Saja, I should have just asked your name too. Yeah, got it. I should have remembered. Sorry. Hind. Saja.
هسا أنا ما بعرف مدى منطقية اللي بفكر فيه، بس أنا بفكر إنه هي أساسا الرقابة كيف بلشت، أو يعني خلينا نحكي جمع المعلومات هو أساسا كان هو الوسيلة، يعني الرقابة أو الملاحظة كانت أول وسيلة عشان نجمع معلومات ونراكم معرفة عن الأمور. فبالتالي يعني هي الرقابة أساسا أنا بدي أجمع معلومات وأصنف، فما فيها إشكالية إطلاقا. يعني فأنا بشوف إنه يعني كل العلماء هيك بلشوا أساسا إنه إحنا نلاحظ كيف سواء بالنسبة للنباتات أو المجتمعات أو أي شيء علشان إحنا نراكم معرفة. فأنا بشوف إنه يعني حتى لو إنه صنفنا المجتمعات أو الدول أو خلينا نحكي يعني أي شيء يعني حطيناه بالتصنيفات هاي، بالعكس ممكن تساعدنا لنخلق خلينا نحكي لغة مشتركة ما بين هاي المجتمعات. فلو طلعنا فيها مثلا عالميا يعني ممكن نحل كتير مشاكل حتى وإن كان على سبيل جمع المعلومات سواء كان عن أفراد أو مجتمعات. فبالتالي يعني أنا مش بحكي إنه حنخلق حكومة عالمية أو ما شابه ذلك، بس إنه يعني بتساعدنا إنه نعرف بعض أكثر، فبالتالي نقلل الخلافات ما بيناتنا. يعني ممكن بحكي شيء أوكي يعني مش بالضرورة يكون متفق يعني بس هي إلها البوزيتيف سايد اللي إحنا بندور عليه، اللي هو يعني نخلق لغة مشتركة ما بين الأفراد والمجتمعات، واللي هو الليبرالية اللي بتحكي فيه ومؤسساتها، واللي هي أساسا قائمة على مسألة المعلومات وتوافرها. يعني أنا إذا عندي معلومات عن هاي اللي هي المفروض متاحة لكل الأفراد، ما بعرف أنا هيك بفكر، فمش بالضرورة يكون يوافقني. فيعني هو يعني ندور للإشي الإيجابي للموضوع. يعني ما بلاش نفكر إنه هو اختراق لخصوصيتنا، بقدر ما إنه ماشي ممكن إنه بدنا يعني نوصل لهاي اللغة المشتركة ما بين المجتمعات كلها من خلال توافر المعلومات، بس مش أكثر أو أقل، اللي هي بنى عليها مسألة المعرفة والعلم اللي هو تراكم المعرفة بس.
Okay, let's talk about this then. This is good. Thank you for the question. You seem to be, well, you couched your remarks in terms of information, gathering information, sharing information, and so on, which is a good place to go. And we were talking about the internet and the ways in which the internet could be used. It's interesting, you know, that the internet went through several phases. I think we talked about this on a previous day. That it was a military enterprise in the first place that created the internet. And then, because it was military research, it tended to then be used next by other people who were in research but non-military. So that's when it came into the universities in the 1970s and 1980s. Already the internet, or what was to become the internet, was in existence. Then in 1994, only just over 20 years ago, the World Wide Web was invented. And this made for the opportunity for the internet to be used in new ways where information could be shared and passed from one to another much more freely, and it could also be indexed, and we could make connections that weren't previously made. At that time, the internet was still not commercial. There was no advertising. There was no selling, buying of data, including personal data. It just did not exist. It's a very short time ago. And then very soon after that, initial ways of commercialization began, and suddenly the whole thing exploded, and in a few years people were making millions of dollars, losing millions of dollars on internet companies buying and selling data and so on. But there was a time when it wasn't commercial. Until the time that it was commercial, it was not used very much for surveillance. Some of the old military and intelligence gathering practices were present, but by and large it wasn't really being used for surveillance. The commercialization of the internet produced an explosion of surveillance. So it's a pretty interesting story. And it's gone through many permutations, and it is still going to develop in new ways. Do you remember the story, the political satire about Gulliver and the little people of Lilliput? Okay, so Bigo's point that we were talking about yesterday is the possibility that when working together, people who actually use the internet all the time, that's all of us, could, through our own tiny little practices, start to make a difference to the way in which the whole online world works. And I think that he has a point. And whether or not the huge Gulliver could really be held down by those tiny little cobweb spider webs is another question. But the idea that some aspects could be limited, I think, is not. So, yeah, and that's only to deal with the negative. The idea that the internet could still be used in a free way for information sharing and so on and so forth is still open, I think. And there are a number of ways in which that is being encouraged by advocacy groups, NGOs, internet organizations, United Nations, committees anyway, that are dedicated to reforming the internet to be used in different ways. There are numerous ways in which I think change could and will, in some cases, come online. And exactly the sort of positive spin that you're putting on it could once again become a reality where surveillance, I think, now that it's occurring, will always have some part to play in the way the internet develops. Very difficult to eliminate it completely. But at the same time, I think that the positive aspects of the original kind of dream of the internet in the early 1990s it's still possible to retrieve them and revitalize them for the future. So yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I think both surveillance can be reduced online, and also that some of the original potential can be released. So I think there are arguments to be made there. I mean, again, like we were saying in the answer to other questions, there's always going to be negotiation. There's always going to be kind of abrasive moments and clashes within the online world. But I still think there are possibilities for reform and change online. Anyway, what your question means is that we finish class on a very positive note. And I hope you'll remember the bigger point from earlier about the optics of hope, which was the starting point I was suggesting for our consideration. So we're meeting tomorrow. Did you want to say something about that? No, one. Yep. Yep. So have a good evening. If you have other questions you want to ask, either save them up or find another context to tell me.